The dust in this valley had a color that August. Not brown, not gold. Something closer to bone. Fields that had fed cattle for 2 generations now cracked open in long, thirsty seams, wide enough in places to swallow a boot to the ankle. Fence posts leaned where the ground beneath them had shrunk and let go. Even the crows had stopped bothering with the Whitlock Ranch, because there was nothing left there worth picking at. And then there was the strip of green. It ran along the low end of a farm that most of the valley still called, half as a joke and half as a warning, the Dead Acres. From the ridge road above it, travelers slowed their wagons without quite knowing why. Some said it looked like a mistake, a patch the drought had simply forgotten to punish. Others said it looked deliberate, though none of them could explain how anyone made rain fall exactly where they wanted it to. Nobody in town had an answer. What they had, instead, was a story about the woman who lived there, and about the ditches she had dug 2 summers earlier that led, as far as anyone could tell, absolutely nowhere. At the time, half the valley had laughed. The other half had simply stopped speaking to her, which in a place that small was its own kind of judgment. She had not argued with any of them. She had only kept digging, in a direction none of the men could make sense of, following something in the shape of the land that she never once tried to explain out loud. By the time the worst drought in memory settled over the valley, like a lid over a pot, most of her neighbors had stopped asking what she'd been doing out there before dawn, with a shovel and a dog that refused, for reasons of its own, to drink from half the creek. They were too busy watching their own herds thin out to notice hers hadn't. What follows is a reconstruction, drawn from the local accounts and the kind of stories a valley tells for decades after the fact, of how one widow read a piece of ground everyone else had already given up on, and why the driest summer on record was the thing that finally proved her right. If you're watching this from somewhere dry tonight, somewhere waiting on rain that hasn't come, tell us in the comments. Stories like hers survive because people still recognize themselves in them. And if this kind of frontier wisdom means something to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. Ruth Calloway arrived in the valley with 1 wagon, 1 son, and considerably less money than anyone selling land that year would have liked to see. She was 38 years old, a widow for just under 2 years, and she had come from a county 3 days east where her late husband's brother had made it clear, without ever quite saying so, that a woman and a boy could stay in his house only for so long before they became a burden he'd rather not carry. Ruth had understood the arithmetic of that kindness. She had also understood that she needed a piece of ground that belonged to no one but herself, even if that ground was the cheapest one for sale. The Dead Acres had been cheap for a reason. The previous owner, a man named Higgins who left without much explanation, had spent nearly 6 years trying to raise anything worth selling on that land and had failed each season a little worse than the last. By the time he gave up, the local opinion had hardened into something close to fact. The soil was thin. The slope was wrong. The whole parcel sat low enough that water either drowned it in spring or abandoned it completely by July. Silas Whitlock, whose ranch bordered the property to the north, had tried to talk her out of it the week the sale went through. He was not unkind about it. He simply laid out, plainly and without malice, everything he had watched go wrong on that ground during his own 30 years in the valley. Ruth had listened to all of it, thanked him, and signed the papers anyway. Her son, Jonah, 12 years old and quiet in the particular way of boys who have watched their mother lose things she couldn't get back, did not ask many questions about the decision. He unloaded the wagon. He fixed the sagging gate on the first afternoon without being asked. And in the evenings, while his mother sat on the porch steps studying the shape of the land in the last of the light, he sat beside her, saying nothing. The same way he had learned to say nothing about a great many things since his father died. What none of them said out loud that first week was the obvious question hanging over the whole arrangement. The rains that year had already come late and left early, and every rancher in the valley was watching the sky with the particular tightness of people who had seen bad years before and knew how to recognize the early signs of a worse one coming. Ruth Calloway had bought the one piece of land nobody else wanted. In the 1 year, nobody could afford to be wrong about the ground beneath their feet. For the first several weeks, Ruth did not plant anything. This alone was enough to draw comment. A new owner with a family to feed, and a single growing season standing between her and real trouble, was expected to break ground immediately, before the soil dried further and the window closed entirely. Instead, she walked. Every morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, she crossed the property on foot. Slowly, often stopping for what seemed to Jonah like no reason at all. She noted where the morning frost still clung to the grass longest, and where it vanished first, as though some patches of ground held the cold differently than others. She noted where a thin, stubborn line of green grass persisted along one low stretch, even as the rest of the field browned around it, weeks before any deliberate irrigation had touched the land at all. She carried a notebook, worn soft at the corners, that had belonged to her husband. He had used it for accounts and small farm records during their marriage back east. Now she used it for something closer to a map of habits, where water pooled, however briefly, after the rare rain, where it seemed to vanish immediately, as if the ground there was hungrier or perhaps simply better connected to something running beneath it, where the old fence line dipped, and whether that dip meant anything about how the whole field tilted from one end to the other. Jonah found this harder to make sense of than almost anything else about the move. He had expected hard labor, and he was prepared for it. What he had not expected was for his mother to spend 3 weeks, apparently, doing nothing but staring at grass and frost, filling a dead man's ledger with observations that led, as far as he could tell, nowhere. Silas Whitlock noticed the walking, too, from his side of the fence line, and mentioned it once to his wife, with the particular tone of a man trying not to sound unkind about a neighbor. He did not think Ruth Calloway was foolish. He simply could not yet see what she was looking for, and 30 years of ranching in that valley had taught him that land this poor did not usually reward that kind of patience. What Ruth had noticed, though she had not yet said it aloud to anyone, was that the driest ground and the greenest ground on her property were separated by less distance than made any obvious sense. Something beneath the surface was behaving differently from one patch of dirt to the next, and she intended to understand exactly what before she trusted a single seed to any of it. Duke had come with them from the old county, a graying mixed-breed dog old enough that Jonah had stopped expecting much from him beyond company and the occasional bark at a passing wagon. It was Duke, not Ruth, who first drew a clear line across the property that summer. The creek that crossed the southern edge of the dead acres had already thinned to a shallow, uncertain trickle by late June, the kind of creek that made a sound in some stretches and simply disappeared into damp gravel in others. Every morning Duke made his way down to it out of old habit, and every morning he drank from the same handful of spots and refused, without any apparent hesitation, several others just a short walk further along. At first Jonah assumed the dog was simply particular, the way old animals sometimes become about small things. But after nearly 2 weeks of watching the same pattern repeat itself precisely, he mentioned it to his mother almost as a joke, expecting her to laugh it off. Ruth did not laugh. She walked down to the creek herself that same afternoon and knelt at the spots Duke avoided, running her fingers through the mud at the edge, then walked the short distance to the spots he favored and did the same. The difference was subtle enough that she could not have explained it in a single sentence to a skeptical neighbor. The ground near where Duke drank held its dampness longer after the water had visibly receded. The ground he avoided dried almost immediately, as though whatever moisture passed through it left again quickly, running off toward somewhere else entirely. It was a small thing. An old dog choosing where to drink was not proof of anything a rational person could act on, and Ruth knew that better than anyone who might have doubted her. But it matched, closely enough to matter, the same pattern she had already begun sketching in her husband's old ledger. The frost that lingered, the grass that persisted, the low line running from the northeast corner of the property down toward the creek, where something about the ground seemed to hold on to water rather than simply losing it to the sky or the sun. She did not yet know what she intended to do with any of this. But for the first time since arriving on the dead acres, she began to suspect that the land had never actually been empty of water. It had simply been losing whatever water it received before anyone thought to ask where that water was going. That night, she added one new line to the ledger, longer than the others, and underlined it twice. The digging began on a Tuesday, and by Thursday half the valley had heard about it. Ruth started at the low corner of the property, near where Duke drank, and worked a shallow trench outward from there in a direction that made no immediate sense to anyone watching. It did not run toward the house. It did not run toward the barn, where a cistern might reasonably need feeding. It ran, instead, along a line that followed the faint dip Ruth had marked in her ledger weeks earlier, curving gently across 2 fields before ending in what looked, to any passerby, like nothing at all. Jonah helped because his mother asked him to, and because refusing was not something he had ever seriously considered. But he worked those first days with the particular reluctance of someone following instructions he privately doubted, glancing more than once toward the ridge road, where neighbors occasionally slowed their wagons to watch a widow and her son dig a ditch that led nowhere. The talk in town moved quickly, as talk in small valleys tends to do. Some of it was gentle, the kind of comment made with a shake of the head rather than any real malice. Some of it was less gentle. Agnes Pruitt, who ran the most prosperous farm in the valley, and had never entirely hidden her opinion that a widow alone had no business managing land at all, was heard remarking at the general store that grief did strange things to a person's judgment, and that digging trenches to nowhere was as clear a sign of it as she had seen in years. Ruth heard versions of these comments eventually, second-hand, the way such things always arrive. She did not answer any of them directly. She kept digging, a little further each week, following the same faint line the frost and the grass and an old dog's habits had already shown her, long before a single neighbor had noticed anything unusual about her land at all. What she had not yet told anyone, not even Jonah, was the actual shape of what she believed she was building. She was not digging a trench to carry water somewhere useful. She was digging along the paths water already wanted to take, in the hope of slowing it down enough, in enough places, that the ground beneath the dead acres might finally be allowed to keep some small portion of what it had always been losing. Whether that idea would survive contact with an actual drought, she did not yet know. The valley had not seen a truly bad one in nearly a decade, and the last time it had, the dead acres had failed along with almost everything else. Silas Whitlock did not come over to mock her. That distinction mattered, and it was one Ruth understood even as she braced for the conversation. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, hat in hand, and asked if he could walk the line of the new trench with her. Ruth agreed, and for the better part of an hour Silas laid out, calmly and in some detail, exactly why he believed the work she was doing would not hold up once real trouble arrived. He told her about his own attempt, nearly 15 years earlier, to reroute a section of runoff on his own property using a similar method. He had dug for the better part of a season, following what he believed at the time was a sound reading of the land, only to watch a single hard rain undo most of it in one night. the water finding new paths around his work rather than settling into it. The soil in that part of the valley, he explained, tended to seal itself hard after long dry stretches, so that when rain did finally come, it often ran across the surface rather than soaking in, no matter how many channels a person carved to guide it. It was not a foolish argument. Ruth recognized that immediately, and she said as much to him directly, which seemed to surprise him more than any disagreement would have. What she did not fully explain, because she was not yet certain enough of it herself to put into words a skeptical neighbor might repeat around town, was that she was not trying to move water somewhere new. She was trying to slow it down long enough, in the specific places she had already spent weeks mapping, that it might soak into ground that had a genuine talent for holding on to moisture once given the chance. Silas listened to what little she offered, and did not argue further. He also did not offer encouragement. He simply nodded, said he hoped she was right, and told her that if the trenches failed the way his had, she would lose the better part of a growing season she likely could not afford to lose. Jonah, watching from the porch, understood for the first time that his mother's plan had real, capable doubt standing against it, not just idle gossip from people who had never tried anything like it. That understanding sat with him more heavily than the mockery ever had. Ruth watched Silas walk back toward his own fence line and said nothing further about the conversation that evening. But she opened the ledger again before bed, checking her notes on the low corner of the property against everything Silas had just told her about hardened, sealed soil, and found herself uncertain, for the first time since she'd started, whether she had accounted for that possibility at all. The rain came in mid-September, earlier than expected, and lighter than anyone had hoped for, the kind of rain that dampens dust without truly reaching it. Ruth had been waiting for exactly this. A modest rain, she reasoned, would tell her something a full storm could not, since it would show her clearly where the water went without the chaos of a true downpour to confuse the picture. She stood at the edge of the trench system for most of the afternoon, watching. At first, it seemed to be working. Water gathered in the shallow channels near the northeast corner, moving slowly along the path she had cut weeks earlier. But within an hour, she noticed it beginning to skip sections entirely, cutting new paths across the harder ground exactly where Silas had warned her it might, running past the trenches rather than settling into them. By evening, when the rain stopped, roughly a third of the system had done what she'd hoped. The rest had simply been bypassed, the water finding its own way toward the creek by a route that owed nothing to the weeks of digging that preceded it. Jonah walked the line with her afterward, in the fading light, and for the first time voiced the doubt he had been carrying quietly for weeks. He asked her not unkindly whether they had wasted the better part of the summer on something that didn't actually work. Ruth did not have an immediate answer for him. She crouched instead at one of the points where the water had clearly skipped past the trench, running her hand along the hardened surface of the soil, feeling for whatever it was that had made this particular stretch behave so differently from the ground only a short distance away. She told Jonah, honestly, that she did not yet know whether the whole plan had failed or whether only part of it had. She did not pretend the evening had gone the way she'd hoped. What she did say, quietly enough that he had to lean in to hear it over the last dripping of the rain from the barn roof, was that a plan failing part way rarely meant the whole idea was wrong. It usually meant she had misunderstood one specific detail, and that detail was still findable if she was willing to look closely enough. Jonah did not fully believe her that night, but he noticed, walking back to the house, that his mother did not look defeated. She looked like someone doing arithmetic in her head, turning a number over and over until it finally came out even. 3 nights after the rain, unable to let the failure sit unexamined, Ruth took a lantern and walked the trench line alone after dark. She had chosen night deliberately. In daylight, The eye tended to smooth over small details, filling gaps with assumption. At night, with only lantern light to work by, she found she paid closer attention to texture and shape, to the faint gleam of standing moisture where the ground still held it, and to the places where the soil had already dried to a dull, matte hardness within hours of the rain passing through. She followed the low line of the property from the northeast corner down towards the creek, crouching every few dozen feet to press her palm flat against the earth. In the sections where the trench had worked as intended, the ground still held a faint coolness, a lingering dampness 2 to 3 inches beneath the surface, even 3 days after the rain. In the sections where the water had skipped past, the soil felt uniformly dry, almost dusty, as though the rain had never touched it at all. It was somewhere near the middle of the property, where the failure had been worst, that she finally understood her mistake. The trench there had been cut to roughly the same shallow depth as the rest of the system, following the same angle she had used elsewhere. But the ground in that stretch sat slightly higher, sloped at a steeper angle than she had accounted for, and a shallow channel simply could not hold water long enough against that particular grade before gravity pulled it past the edge entirely. She had not misjudged the overall idea, she realized, kneeling there in the dark, with mud on her hands, and the lantern casting long shadows across the cracked ground. She had misjudged the depth needed for one specific stretch of land, treating the whole property as though its slope were uniform, when it clearly was not. She walked the rest of the line slowly, marking with small stones the sections that needed to be cut deeper and re-angled slightly against the steeper grade, and the sections that had already proven themselves and could be left alone. By the time she returned to the house, well past midnight, she had a clearer picture in her ledger than she had managed in the entire previous month. Jonah, half asleep, heard her come in and asked, from the dark of his room, whether she'd found what she was looking for. Ruth told him she thought she finally had. She did not yet know if it would be enough. Reopening a trench that had already failed once was harder, in some ways, than digging the first one had been. Ruth began with the middle stretch, the section where the steeper grade had defeated her earlier work, cutting it nearly twice as deep as before, and adjusting the angle slightly to run more directly across the slope rather than along it. It was slower work than the first pass had been, and it came at a point in the season when every week of labor mattered more than the last, with the true dry months of summer still ahead of them. Jonah helped again, though this time with a different quality of attention than before. He did not fully understand the reasoning behind the deeper cut or the adjusted angle, and he said so plainly when his mother explained it to him one evening over supper. But he had watched her walk the line at night with the lantern, had seen her mark the stones, had seen the specific, deliberate correction rather than a stubborn repetition of the same failed approach. That distinction mattered to him more than he expected it to. Silas Whitlock noticed the renewed digging from his side of the fence, and said nothing for several days. When he finally did ride over, it was not to repeat his earlier warning. He asked, instead, what she had changed, and listened without interruption while she explained the difference in grade she'd found along that middle stretch. He did not offer approval. He simply nodded, the way a man does when an argument he expected to win has instead gotten more complicated than he'd anticipated, and rode back to his own land without further comment. By the time the second pass was finished, early October had settled over the valley, and the true test of the season, the long, dry stretch that everyone up and down the valley had been dreading since spring, had not yet fully arrived. Ruth stood at the edge of the reworked trench system one evening with Jonah beside her, looking at a piece of ground that had already failed her once and had cost her weeks she could not easily spare to fix. She did not know, standing there, whether the correction would hold against anything more serious than the mild rain that had exposed the flaw in the first place. What she did know, and said aloud to Jonah for the first time since the failure, was that she finally understood her own land well enough to trust the next test that came, whatever shape it took. Neither of them yet knew how severe that test would turn out to be. By the middle of November, the valley had stopped talking about ordinary bad luck and started using the word drought without any qualifier attached to it. Weeks passed without a single meaningful rain. The creek that ran along the southern edge of Ruth's property thinned further still, until even the stretch where Duke once refused to drink had gone quiet and still. Fields that had been merely struggling in August began to fail outright. Agnes Pruitt, whose herd had always been the pride of the valley, lost 11 head of cattle in a span of roughly 3 weeks, a loss significant enough that word of it reached every farm within a day's ride. The mood in town shifted from mild concern to something closer to fear. Families that had weathered lean years before began quietly discussing whether this one might be different, might be the kind of season that forced hard decisions about which animals to sell, which fields to abandon, and whether staying in the valley at all still made sense for families without deep reserves to draw on. Ruth's own fields, by contrast, held on. Not lushly, not without visible strain, but noticeably better than the ground around them. The strip of green that travelers on the ridge road had once slowed to puzzle over had thinned somewhat under the relentless dry heat, but it had not vanished the way so much of the valley's grazing land had. She did not celebrate this. She understood, better than almost anyone else in the valley, how much of what she'd built still depended on a test she had not yet faced. A mild rain in September was one thing. A true drought stretching across months was another entirely. And she knew the difference between soil that held moisture reasonably well and soil that had genuinely been taught, through careful correction, to keep what little water it received. Jonah, meanwhile, had begun fielding a different kind of question from boys his age in town, curious rather than mocking, about what exactly his mother had done differently. He did not have a full answer for them. He understood the shape of it, the trenches, the corrected grade, the months of walking and watching that had come before any digging at all. But the deeper reasoning still belonged mostly to his mother's ledger, filled now with nearly a year of careful observation. What none of them yet knew, as November gave way to the coldest, driest stretch the valley had seen in close to a decade, was that the real test wasn't going to arrive gradually. It was going to arrive all at once, in a single night, in a form none of Ruth's careful observations had fully prepared her for. The storm arrived in early December, and it did not arrive the way anyone had been hoping for. After months without meaningful rain, the valley received, in the span of roughly 6 hours, what later estimates placed at nearly 3 inches of hard, driving rain, the kind that fell in sheets rather than showers. Under ordinary conditions, ground that had been properly prepared might have welcomed such a downpour as salvation. But soil that has spent months baking under relentless heat often develops a hardened surface, and a hardened soil does not absorb water gently. It sheds it, fast and violent, exactly the way Silas Whitlock had warned Ruth it might, all those months earlier. Ruth understood the danger the moment the rain began in earnest. A storm this hard, hitting ground this dry, could do more damage in a single night than months of drought had managed on their own, tearing through poorly prepared channels and carrying away exactly the kind of loose, dry topsoil her fields depended on. She and Jonah worked through the worst of it by lantern light, moving along the trench line in the driving rain, watching for the specific points where water began cutting new paths rather than following the corrected channels. Twice they found sections where the force of the runoff threatened to overwhelm the depth Ruth had cut back in October, and twice they worked quickly, packing loose stone and cut brush into the most vulnerable stretches to slow the water enough for the ground beneath to have a chance at absorbing it. It was, by any honest account, an uncertain night. Ruth did not know, working soaked and exhausted somewhere near 2 in the morning, whether the corrections she had made months earlier would hold against a storm this severe, or whether she was about to watch an entire year of careful observation get carried downstream in a matter of hours. Jonah, working beside her without complaint for the first time since the whole project began, asked her once, shouting over the sound of the rain, whether they should simply give up on the middle stretch and focus everything on saving what they could closer to the house. Ruth did not answer him right away. She was watching the water at the reworked section, the one that had failed once already back in September, waiting to see which way it would move. By the time the worst of the storm passed, sometime near dawn, both of them were too exhausted to know for certain what they had actually accomplished. The rain had stopped. The trenches, as far as they could tell in the dark and the mud, had mostly held. But neither of them would know the true answer until daylight showed them what the property actually looked like once the water had finished moving. The morning came clear and cold, the kind of stillness that often follows a hard storm, and Ruth walked the property before Jonah had even woken. What she found was not a miracle. She was careful, in the days that followed, never to describe it that way to anyone who asked. The middle stretch, the section that had failed once in September and been reworked in October, had held through the night largely intact, the deeper cut and adjusted angle doing exactly what she had hoped, slowing the worst of the runoff long enough for a meaningful portion of it to soak into ground that had spent months learning, through careful correction, how to hold on to water rather than losing it immediately. Not every section had performed equally well. 2 shorter stretches near the eastern edge had eroded more than she would have liked, the water cutting new channels that she would need to repair before the next serious rain arrived. But the losses were contained, manageable, the kind of imperfect result that any honest observer would recognize as success rather than failure, even if it fell short of anything resembling perfection. By mid-morning, word had begun to travel, the way it always did in that valley, faster than any single rider could have carried it alone. Silas Whitlock arrived first, walking the trench line beside Ruth in near silence, examining the reworked middle section with the careful attention of a man reassessing an argument he had made in good faith and was now willing to revise. He did not apologize for his earlier doubts, and Ruth did not ask him to. What he did do, before leaving, was ask whether she would be willing to walk his own land with him sometime soon, to see whether any of what she'd learned might apply to ground he had once tried something similar on and abandoned. Agnes Pruitt did not come that first day. She came 3 days later, after losing 4 more head of cattle to ground that had turned to little more than dust, and she came without the sharpness she had once used at the general store. She asked Ruth directly, in front of 2 other neighbors who had gathered nearby, how the trenches actually worked, and listened without interruption while Ruth explained, as plainly as she could, that the ditches had never been about bringing water to the land. They had simply given water already passing through a reason to stay a little longer before it moved on. By the following spring, versions of Ruth Calloway's trenches had appeared on 3 other properties in the valley, each adapted slightly to the particular slope and soil of its own ground, since no 2 stretches of that valley, as Ruth had learned firsthand, behaved in quite the same way. She did not become wealthy from any of it. The Dead Acres remained a modest farm, and Ruth remained, in most practical respects, exactly the widow with limited means who had arrived there roughly 2 years earlier. What had changed, more than her circumstances, was the way the valley spoke about her. The jokes about grief and pointless digging had quietly disappeared sometime around the December storm and never fully returned, even among people who had once repeated them freely. Jonah, older now by the particular measure that a single hard year can age a person, had stopped needing to explain his mother's work to curious boys in town. Most of them had either watched the trenches themselves or heard enough second-hand detail that the explanation no longer sounded strange to anyone. Silas Whitlock did eventually rework a portion of his own land, following a modified version of what Ruth had shown him, and it held up reasonably well through the following summer, though he was always quick to point out, with the particular caution of a man who had been wrong once already, that his ground and Ruth's ground were not identical, and that whatever worked for one farm still required its own careful observation before anyone assumed it would work exactly the same way elsewhere. What can be said with confidence, looking back on that year from any distance, is fairly simple. The trenches Ruth Calloway dug were never designed to bring rain to a place that had none. They were designed to notice where the water already wanted to go, and to give it a reason to stay a little longer before it left. The valley remembered the drought as one of the hardest in its history, but it remembered Ruth Calloway, more specifically, as the widow who had spent an entire summer walking her own land in silence before anyone else understood there was anything worth looking for. She had not beaten the drought by working harder than her neighbors, though she had certainly worked hard. She had beaten it by paying closer attention than anyone else had thought to ground that everyone else had already decided wasn't worth a second look. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or agricultural advice.